could just talk. They're pretty. Don't get in trouble. Hey, how are you? So happy to be here. It's going to be so much fun to have the reception afterward out there, too. Hello, Eric. How are you? Hi, Ben.
Who wants to go sit down?
Yes. And it's all road. You're going to use this to introduce them. I'm going to hand it to you after introducing you. So if you could, the stairs are over there, just take a seat and we'll begin.
Okay. Do you want me to get going?
Let him settle in.
Okay. Hi, Tim. Sophie Howland.
Hi.
We met a few times in DC. It's good to see you. It seems weird seeing you in Vermont, right?
Well, you know, I actually do come to Vermont periodically.
I did hear
And
some.
I'm planning on coming here a lot more, but never enough.
Oh, well, I think you're sitting on the same seat that Senator Leahy did
Yeah,
a few weeks ago. But,
I knew he was here, and the last time I was here was with him.
that was a while back, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, it was 10 years ago. 15 years ago.
Before my time, yeah. It's good to see you back. Yeah?
I don't know why everyone complains about the view around here. Do you?
Seriously?
Yeah, no.
I started to feel personally offended there.
It's incredible. Absolutely incredible.
And I'm glad to have somebody with your accent, because it's like, the accent of some, of Vermont's famous Nobel laureates. Rudyard Kipling was the first.
Good point. Who lived right here?
I bring a little sophistication to the...
Well, I don't know. I would think I think it was our sophistication, Rudyard Kipling and Windham County's sophistication that brought you here.
Oh, that would be it. All right. Okay. Okay. I'm just worried about the microphone, actually. But it was welcome, everybody, to this very special evening, the annual Peter Galbraith Lecture. My name is Sophie Howlett, and I'm the president of SIT. And I will say that it's an absolute pleasure, a real delight to have the Windham World Affairs Council here with us this evening. Somebody just asked me, actually, is this marking the beginning of a special new or a renewed relationship with the Windham World Affairs Council? All I can say is that absolutely, if you guys are all in, then we are absolutely all in too. Because after all, I think we have a lot in common with each other. We all care about what's going on out there. And I really am reminded of a couple of years ago, we had Peter Welch standing there when we brought out our blue plaque as the first ever training site for the Peace Corps. And he looked out to this beautiful view, which I've just had kind of semi-lampooned by our guests tonight. Our beautiful view, which I hope you will enjoy later. And he said, what is this? Here we are in Vermont, but just beyond there, just beyond those beautiful hills is the whole world. And I think that's the sentiment that both SIT and the Windham World Affairs Council shares. So I'm absolutely delighted to get this opportunity to welcome you to campus. I hope you enjoy. Meanwhile, I've got 1,000 students, I think, landing this week in more than 45 different countries. So yeah, I'm kind of like, I'm just trying to make sure everybody's safe. So thank you for giving me also a lovely hour out of my schedule to come and greet you all. So with no further ado, welcome. I'm so grateful that we have Peter here, that we have Tim here, and I'm now going to hand you over to our chair. Thank you
so much. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for attending, for being here today, for helping to support our work. I'm Tamara Sten, chairperson of the board of Windham World Affairs Council. And I want to give a heartfelt thanks to our sponsors, okay, to help us be able to be here, to make this event possible. So thank you, SIT and World Learning, of which I'm an alum, so it's kind of fun to kind of come full circle and be back here in the IC, where I used to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner under the flag of the countries that we came from. Mine was Bolivia. And now to be here under the lights with all of you, it's really a full circle. So big thank you to World Learning. Also big thanks, I got my good talking notes here, to the Vermont Independent Media and the Commons, especially to Lynn Barrett, who's been a fantastic partner and has helped us so much with outreach, and BCTV for doing the live stream today. So welcome everybody who's on our live stream. So those of us who are also virtual. Thanks to Brooks Memorial Library and the Vermont Humanities Council for its America 250 Partnership Grant, okay, which has been huge in helping us to really pull forward with our mission of Windham World Affairs Council, and has actually helped with some of the props that we see here with our logo and our banners. So big thanks to them for their partnership grant. And also helping us in the years leading up to the 250th anniversary of the founding of the U.S. in July 2026, so we're working towards that. And thanks to the board. Okay, board members, if folks can just raise their hands. We got Claire Morgan Gillis, and we have Scott Cooper, who people saw when they first came in, Meryl Sovna, Caitlin Ford, our newest member, woo, Jim Kirby, Paul Love, and Lissa Weinman. Okay, special thanks also to Susan Healy. Where's Susan? Who, without all of her hard work, this wouldn't have been possible. All of her work with the catering, and also to Mary Wallace and other board members whose food contributions made such a beautiful touch to our event tonight. So please check out the schedule. Up front we have monthly meetings, we have salons, board meetings, lectures. All of that information is on our website. It's also up at the front desk. And now I want to present our treasurer, Lissa Weinman, to introduce tonight's speakers.
Thanks, Tabra. Thank you, everybody. And good evening. Thank you for being here tonight, and thanks for the people that are attending virtually as well. I don't know how many of you there are, but welcome. Tonight is the annual John Kenneth Galbraith lecture. Sorry, Peter, it's not named for you, but you've been holding the mantle for a while now. But the lecture began many, many years ago. Our organization is 64 years old, and John Kenneth Galbraith was a frequent speaker and participant in the activities of Windham World Affairs Council. So this annual lecture is in his honor. He, as many of you probably know, was a noted economist and author. He wrote, about 45 books, I believe, professor at Harvard for many years, and always cared deeply about this community. So it's fitting to begin with a quote from John Kenneth Galbraith, so I shall. He was a very witty person, an erudite man, wonderful speaker and writer. He coined the term conventional wisdom among many, many other interesting phrases and turns of phrase. But this is the quote I'm going to begin with today. Among all the world's races, Americans are the most prone to misinformation. And this is written many years ago. This is not the consequence of any special preference for mendacity, although at the higher levels of their public administration, that tendency is impressive. It is rather that so much of what they themselves believe is wrong. So in the spirit of that quote, I'm very honored to, to present our two speakers tonight, who will help us perhaps dispel some of our mistaken beliefs and help us share some of their vast experience so that we can look forward to the future and to how we might participate in change in a way that's both more effective and both more illuminated by them. So I also want to mention that this is a lecture as part of our America 250 series leading up to the semi-quinticentennial. We've been partnering with Vermont Independent Media and Brooks Library on a series of lectures and town halls with Meg Mott, our Constitution Wrangler here in this part of the world. So we'll be hosting these town halls and these lectures in order to better understand, well, the name of the program is Examining America's Identity and Role in a Changing World. And this lecture is part of that deep dive that we've been doing, not just with all of you and our members and the public, but also at the local high school through our work with Jody Williams, our own local Nobel Peace Laureate, who is helping mentor students at Brattleboro Union High School. And we've been doing monthly lectures there, and we'll continue this year. It will be the 3rd year. So your support tonight of our organization helps us bring some of these speakers and messages also to youth in our area who, believe me, appreciate it and are eager to learn. Peter actually kicked off the America 250 program last October at Center Congregational Church with his lecture, Is the American Century Over? Most of you know Peter, but I will give a little background. He's held senior positions in the U.S. government and the United Nations. He served as the first U.S. ambassador to Croatia, where he negotiated the 1995 agreement that ended the Croatia War. Pretty impressive. In 2000 and 2001, he served as a senior official in the UN mission in East Timor and concurrently as a cabinet minister in East Timor's first government with responsibility for negotiations on issues resulting from their independence. Currently, he chairs the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, an organization that his father also pertained to. And he's been continuing his work in Syria and helping reunite mothers and children torn apart by war in that area. Tim Reiser is a senior advisor to Senator Peter Welch. He served as senior foreign policy advisor to former U.S. Senator Patrick Leahy, who was here just a few weeks ago. Some of you might have attended that lecture. From 1995 to 2023, handling a wide range of issues. He began his career as a public defender in Vermont. It's his home state. It's where he still lives. And he taught at the Harvard Law School Project on Negotiation. He was a professional staff member of the Appropriations Committee and Democratic clerk of the Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations, a position he held until 2022, overseeing appropriations for the operations and programs of the Department of State, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and other federal agencies, as well as contributions to the UN and other multilateral organizations. This year, he's a visiting fellow at the Perry World House at the University of Pennsylvania. So the speakers will engage in a conversation covering topics that our members have indicated to us they're interested in hearing about tonight. So it will be a conversational, non-moderated format. These guys have known each other a long time. They both served in Congress as staffers for many, many years. They know how things work. So at about 7 o'clock, we will take questions, and you should be ready to get the microphone and pose your questions to the speakers. And after that, we'll adjourn at about 7:20 or so and continue our reception on the beautiful patio out back. So thanks again for everyone who's come tonight online and here, and thank you so much for your support of the Windham World Affairs Council. Thank you, guys.
Can you hear me? All right, does this work? Well, all right, that's better. Now you, yeah. Okay. It's great to be here. I was mentioning to Sophie that about quite some time ago, I was actually briefly on the faculty teaching at SIT, a wonderful place with a fantastic view. And the Windham World Affairs Council is a place near and dear to our family's heart. I think my father was one of the very first speakers, and I certainly remember going with him, maybe in 1961, to, or it might have been 63, to meet with the Peace Corps volunteers, and this is where they were trained. And I'm so glad that there's now a historic plaque to commemorate that. The Windham World Affairs Council is also special, as I learned on a trip with the head of the World Affairs Councils. It is by far the smallest World Affairs Council in the country. Incidentally, there's no Chittenden World Affairs Council or Windsor World Affairs Council. It's the only county in Vermont, and we're far from the biggest with a World Affairs Council. I don't think there's any place else. And why? Because you look out and there's the world beyond, but this was a very international place, not only for being the place where Nobel laureates like Rudyard Kipling lived, and almost in Windham County, so we'll claim it, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Okay, that was Cavendish. Robert Frost. The Experiment in International Living, what was then, I think, European Travel Camp, but this was George Shumlin's operation. So there's just has always been a lot going on internationally, and I'm really thrilled that the Windham World Affairs Council is continuing it. And this might be, over the 64 years, about the 60th time that there's been a Galbraith speaking. My father, I'm catching up on the number of lectures, so maybe we can get a joint name some point, But so I picked up probably when I was ambassador to Croatia, I think. My brother even has spoken, so there's that. But I'm really super thrilled to be here with Tim Reiser, who was so far 38 years on the staff of the United States Senate. And the Senate is staffed by, as Roosevelt said, describing his administration, what he wanted was men with a passion for anonymity. Now we, of course, would not just be men. Yeah, a lot of senators want that. It was always a little more difficult for me than Tim, but I lasted 14 years. But if you can accept that, first, you don't actually remain all that anonymous because people do know what you do and what Tim has done. And so he's had an extraordinary record. I'm going to say a word just about a few things he's done. Incidentally, this title he had, chief clerk, that doesn't mean he's sort of writing stuff down. This is actually a position of great power. But I was very grateful to Tim a couple of years ago. Lisa referred to this. I have been getting children who were born to Yazidi girls, and I really mean girls because the youngest was 10, who were kidnapped in 2014. Their families were murdered, and then they were used as sex slaves by Islamic State fighters. And of course, they had babies. And when the Islamic State fell, their own community came and took away their children. The children went to an orphanage in Syria, the mothers to Iraq. And in 2021, I was able to get a whole bunch of the children. There was a newspaper story about it. Peter Welch called me, and he was a congressman then, And he said, we're going to do something to help. He got in touch with Tim, and I still have the email that he sent. He said, if we can't help, then why the hell are we here? And of course they did. We had to put the girls and their children in a safe house because they were not in danger from ISIS, but again from their own families and from their own community. And that has been funded by the State Department for the last, 3 years. So that's just... It's just, yeah.
I was just saying that none of that would have happened if Peter hadn't. Can you hear me now? I was just saying that never would have happened if Peter had not cared about those women and decided to do something about it. And I just, took his advice. But it takes someone to take the initiative, which the government wasn't doing. And very often that's the situation. It's people like all of you who I'm not used to being like an opera singer, so okay, so rather than interrupt Peter, I'll just let you continue. But I just want to say that he really did an amazing thing by caring enough about those people to do something about it.
Well, thank you. But, what's really key is to have somebody like Tim, well, frankly, Peter Welch, who got in touch with me while I was still on my way back from Syria, called me, and then said he'd do something, and then got in touch with the guy who could do something. And frankly, many people, there was nothing that would have made Tim do it. He wasn't working for Peter Welch. Obviously, he's the kind of guy who thought this would be a good idea and understood it. But this is only a few of the things that Tim has done, and there's so many. We were talking about Oppenheimer and his role in getting the decision to deny his security clearance reversed or expunged. But he got Alan Gross out of Cuba. He part of that deal involved having live human sperm flown from California to Cuba. He played a really key role.
It wasn't mine.
It was the story is that all part of this exchange involved some Cuban spies who were in federal prison, and since federal prison doesn't allow conjugal visits, his wife, I guess, was wanted to have a baby, maybe getting of a certain age, and so this is what was arranged. And that, of course, helped pave the way for an exchange of spies and ultimately for Alan Gross to get out. He played a key role in the landmine issue, and I'd be absolutely critical. But really, I think what people don't understand is the role that certain staff, particularly those who handle legislation, have. Staff like Tim. I will just say a word about how it worked at the Foreign Relations Committee, because the way the system's supposed to work is there's supposed to be bills that authorize activities. So they set the policy, and they basically say a certain amount is authorized, and then it's up to the appropriators to just come up with the money. But the reality is that in this century, authorization legislation almost never passes, particularly in the foreign affairs area. And so it is the appropriators who set the policy. But who among the appropriators who sets the policy? Who is it? The senators, or is it the staff? And the reality is that legislating in the U.S. Senate is primarily done by the staff. The way it worked on the Foreign Relations Committee, and I handled one of the committee's two main bills when it passed, is I would prepare what was called the chairman's draft. I suspect Tim would do the same thing. So everything that I thought should be in the bill, the ideas I had,
ideas that other staff had, maybe some that senators had, would go in the bill. I would then write a memo to the chairman saying, this is all in the bill, here's why all of it's here, and after you've been there a while, you know the chairman is exactly what argument to make to him, and you know how he'll respond. And it never happened in the years that I prepared the draft, and literally hundreds of pages of legislation, that he ever said no. Now it then goes to markup. Some of the stuff didn't make it through markup in committee. When the committee is voting, that happens. And then it goes to the floor, and some of it, well, you're on the floor with the senator, and other senators are coming up with the amendments. What does he do? He hands the amendment over to you to look at it, and then you give the thumbs up or thumbs down, or you propose modification. You have to negotiate it. And then, you know this textbook, it then goes to a conference with the House version of the bill. But conferences are almost entirely done by the staff. In again, legislation I worked on, there might be 200 or 300 items of difference in the bill, and sometimes it'd be a paper conference, meaning the senators and House members would never meet. And sometimes there'd be 4 or 5 issues that couldn't be resolved, and there'd be an actual conference. Now, Tim can't say all this because he's still working there, but what you learned in your high school civics about how it works isn't exactly how it works. And so a guy like Tim, I mean, I was there 14 years. He's been there almost 40, and on the committee that every year is doing a bill. I'm in foreign relations, they don't do these bills anymore. I was involved in probably 6 of them. So that really is, and incidentally, we were talking about a senator who was sympathetic to a project that Tim had, a Republican, and he pointed out that the senator would vote against how Leahy would vote 95% of the time, only 5% agreement. But none of these issues actually ever went to a vote. Where you're really making a difference is on the things that don't go to a vote. So it is there, being the person who is providing the initial draft, the person who is negotiating it in the subcommittee, the person who's on the floor with the senator who's looking at every bit of legislation, and the person who's negotiating with the House. That's the real legislator, and that's what Tim is, or at least was. Now, of course, you're working for Senator Welch, who's a relatively junior member, but it's really when you have the chairman. Incidentally, this is to say nothing against the Senator Leahy or Senator Pell. They have 3 or 4 committees. They cannot. Tim has worked in an area of very narrow expertise, as did I. I mean, the operations of the State Department Foreign Aid Program. Leahy was chairman of the whole Appropriations Committee, so he had everything: the military, the Health and Human Services, energy, the whole thing. Plus, he had his other committees, Judiciary. Plus, as a senator, of course, you're constantly meeting constituents. You're going to meet with the administration. So, this is the kind of expertise, the way the government works. The Secretary of State is negotiating basically nothing. He appears. But all the hard work of the negotiation are going to be done by people who have knowledge. Incidentally, this is a very Galbraithian idea, not me, my father, who referred in the Affluent Society, wrote about the technocrats. So with that to begin with, a little civics lesson, but I really would like to turn to substance for our discussion, and I'm going to pose some questions to Tim, and then probably will make some points of my own. But I just wanted to ask you, how would you assess the President Biden's foreign policy? And of course, then we get into the issue of what might happen in November.
Well, that is a big question. I feel like I should say just a couple of words of introduction, though, because Peter just did a very good job of describing the role of congressional staff. I never imagined that I would stay in the Senate for 39 years. Leahy just kept getting elected and reelected, and I couldn't think of a better job, actually. than to work for somebody who cared about the same things that I did, but also who was willing to give me the authority to do what I needed to do, because senators are spread much too thin to really learn the details and to learn the substance in the way that is necessary to be able to write the kinds of legislation that appropriates billions of dollars to run the government.
Trillions.
Trillions. In my case, it was about 60 billion, our subcommittee. But it was certainly, I came to realize, one of the best things that Thomas Jefferson and Madison and the rest of them did was to give the power of funding the government to the Congress, because otherwise the executive branch couldn't care less about what we have to say about anything. The fact that we control the money, I would always remind the State Department that they couldn't even turn the lights on if it weren't for us. And so while, our job was to work together, we really want to have one foreign policy, not a Republican foreign policy or a Democratic foreign policy or whatever, but that at the end of the day, it was the Congress that was going to decide how much money, for what purposes, under what conditions, et cetera. And that was a critically important fact that gave Senator Leahy kind of outsized power over most other senators. Not just the fact that he had such seniority, but also that it was as chairman of an appropriations subcommittee that basically funds everything that the U.S. government does around the world, short of the deployment of our armed forces and our intelligence agencies. All our diplomats, all our international aid workers, all our contributions to the United Nations, et cetera. Not only that, but he also ended up as chair of the full committee, which was 12 different subcommittees, as Peter mentioned, that fund the entire government. And so invariably it became the responsibility of the staff to make all those decisions. And you learn what your senator would want you to do and hope that you don't make any big mistakes. I actually, in addition to working on the Appropriations Committee for about 33 years, I handled foreign policy for Senator Leahy. Every senator has somebody who is responsible for advising them on foreign policy and writing speeches and keeping them informed and meeting with constituents or representatives of foreign governments, et cetera. In my case, yep. Okay, I'm sorry. God, how's this? Maybe that's better. And so I also, tried to keep abreast of as much as I could about what was happening in the world and be able to help him respond to people like you and many others. And which brings me kind of to Peter's question. I've actually been pretty disappointed by this administration's foreign policy. On Ukraine, not so disappointed. I think that it's very important that the United States support Ukraine and help Ukraine defend itself under the circumstances. I think it is about much more than Ukraine. And so we have our own interests, and certainly our allies in Europe have a strong interest. But on other issues, I haven't really, frankly, been very happy with this administration's foreign policy, and I'm hoping that if the vice president is elected in November, that there will be some significant changes. I don't know if that's the case, because I really have no idea what she thinks about much that's going on outside this country. She didn't really have a role other than to a limited extent on migration and on Central America, but I don't think handled it particularly well. And I think we really need to rethink how we approach that problem and how we relate and our relations with those countries. And I think the same could be said in terms of our policies in the Middle East our policies towards China, and many other areas of the world where I think we need some new people with new ideas, new ways of approaching the role of the United States. I think it's important that the United States be a leader in the world, but I also think that we need to think about, what does that actually mean for purposes of building strong alliances and really defending the principles and the values that distinguish us from other countries. And I don't think we've always done a very good job of that. So bottom line is, I think we can do a lot better. And I hope that the next administration is one that will think somewhat differently about our role in the world and how best to, for the United States to play a very constructive role, and knowing that, most of the problems in the world we can't begin to solve alone. We need to build alliances with partners and other like-minded countries, and obviously if Donald Trump is elected, there's no hope of that. So,
well, I want to turn to the Middle East in a minute, because obviously that certainly is the most controversial foreign policy question. But I wondered if you could say something more about the critique you have of other parts of the foreign policy. Obviously, at least in my view, there are some real achievements. Restoring American credibility with allies, or maybe it's a low bar compared to Trump. Re-entering the Paris Climate Accords and the domestic legislation with which you played a role on climate. Setting aside the Middle East, where would you find the fault? China, Afghanistan, what would it be?
I'll answer that, but actually, Peter, you ought to talk a little bit about Ukraine, because you were the ambassador to Croatia, that part of the world, and I think that's a really important issue for us to talk about, and sort of how you see that situation resolving itself. Because my own view is that the Ukrainians are not going to defeat the Russians in that war, and so the question is, what is a solution that will preserve the sovereignty of Ukraine, but at the same time end what has become just a catastrophe for the people living there?
Well, that was a good way to evade my question.
I will answer your question.
All right, but I'll take you.
You know much more about this than I do, so I think it would be useful for these people to.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I'll take you up on that, and actually, I have, since the war began, been to Ukraine, to Odessa, partly because I've been talking to the government of Moldova about what it might do should Odessa fall, because it's a very short distance from Odessa to Moldova. First, I think that Biden has done the right thing in supporting Ukraine. Why? Because I think there's a huge amount at stake that goes far beyond Ukraine, and it's not about NATO. It is about the entire international system that has kept peace in the world since 1945. Obviously not a perfect peace, but if you compare it to what came before, we have lived in actually the most peaceful, democratic, least violent time in all of human history. It doesn't feel that way, but statistically that's true. And a great deal of it has to do with the United Nations and what followed in 1945. And what followed in 1945, as embodied in the UN Charter, is that once you're a member of the United Nations and there's no dispute about your territory, then no country can take your territory and successfully annex it And think about it. That is what caused so many wars, including World War II. The only really big attempt since 1945 until 2022, or maybe 2014, Crimea, was Saddam Hussein seizing Kuwait. And that did not end well for Saddam. So it kind of reinforced the rule. Now, there are fights over disputed territories, for sure. Kashmir, obviously, the Palestinian territories, and many others. But in terms of one country going and trying to seize the territory and annex the territory of another, you haven't been able to get away with it. And if in fact, Russia's able to succeed, then it is a real threat to the very thing that has kept the world safe for a long period of time. That said, Tim's implicit in your question is, is this a never-ending war? And if there's a never-ending war, all that does is just lots of people get killed, and that is a huge tragedy, and everything that's going on in Ukraine is a tragedy. Obviously, I don't think Russia's going to be defeated, and I also am always nervous about military actions into Russia. I mean, there's something deeply satisfying about this offensive around Kursk, but one can be nervous about it, and that goes with missile attacks on Russia proper. It's not that they don't deserve it, but it is, we don't want to go to a much greater conflict. So I'm a little cautious about it. But the real issue is, how does this end? And I think there is a way to think about it, which frankly has not appeared in much of the discussion. My sense is that this will end the way the US war in Vietnam ended, the way the Soviet war in Afghanistan ended, and the way the American war in Afghanistan ended, which is that elites, and particularly the children of elites, turn against the war. And if you're thinking about, what is it if you're a Russian? I mean, your country is isolated. Economic conditions have declined. You're a pariah state. To be a Russian now is sort of like what is to be a South African in the 1980s, a white South African. And who is it that you're killing? You're killing people that look very much like you. In fact, they basically speak a very similar language. And you also, I mean, I talked to Russian friends. You could see the body language of, even in some of Putin's meetings, when it's quite clear that even the people close to him did not think this was a great idea. They're going along with it. But there are a lot of who don't think it's a great idea. So my sense is that at a certain point, the price of this is going to be too great. And at least that's my sense, or at least my hope, as to how this ends. Because otherwise, I don't see any way that a Ukrainian leader can agree to give up territory, particularly in these circumstances. So the best you might hope would be some kind of ceasefire. But it's a huge tragedy.
Okay, now to answer your question, I'll just give you a couple of examples. I think there are quite a few of where at least I have been disappointed by this administration, which is not to say that we don't work closely with the administration on many things. We have many shared perspectives with people, some in the State Department and other agencies, but I worked for many years with Senator Leahy to change our policy on Cuba, which had really failed to achieve any of its objectives. And finally, through a whole series of negotiations and sort of fortuitous events, finally President Obama did restore diplomatic relations with Cuba, opened embassies, and we began to, although we have very strong differences with the government of Cuba on many issues, we did find in the 2 years that remained in his administration, many ways that we could cooperate with Cuba, just as we do with Vietnam and other countries whose governments we disagree with, but we have shared interests. And certainly with Cuba, which is very close, our histories, our cultures, our languages, our families, and so, that was, in our view, long overdue. Again, we were often frustrated by the Cuban government, and to this day, frankly, I continue to have many conversations with the Cuban government that are not easy, but I did feel that, when you think about what's in the best interest of the United States, it wasn't to maintain a policy which had failed utterly to achieve any of its objectives. So, when Trump came in, he reversed everything that we had spent. Really, Senator Leahy and I first went to Cuba in 1999, so it was a long process of building relations with Cuba, getting them to trust us, and figuring out, how to convince both governments to talk differently to each other. And then Trump comes in and everything, gets reversed. And, I had hoped that when President Biden was elected, that we would be able to find our way back to a more sensible policy. Unfortunately, that has not happened. There have been a few steps taken because it got to a point when hundreds of thousands of Cubans were leaving the island seeking entry to the United States. And that's the only reason that the White House finally felt they had to do something. And they made some changes, but I told them right then that if what they were proposing was their response, that it was not going to make any difference. And, unfortunately, this administration is coming to an end. We've tried, Senator Leahy and I met with Biden about this. We've tried different ways of convincing the White House staff that, this is a matter of foreign policy. It's not just a matter of what people think in South Florida. And so that's been very disappointing. Our hope is that if Kamala Harris wins and we have a chance to revisit this, that we can get back to a better place on that issue. So that's one. The other is, I think that the way we left Afghanistan was really deplorable and a catastrophe for many people in Afghanistan. I spent an hour and a half on the phone today with Molly Gray, our former lieutenant governor, who's devoting every day to trying to help Afghans who are resettled here in the United States, but many of them don't have green cards. Their families are back in Afghanistan. They have no idea when they're going to be able to reunite with their families, if ever. And there are tens of thousands of Afghans scattered around the world trying to find some stability in their lives as a result of what happened when we left Afghanistan. And while we did evacuate over 120-something thousand Afghans, there are many more who remain in great jeopardy, who helped the United States, who trusted us, and who we've basically walked away from. And so we're focused right now on the several hundred Afghans in Vermont who are in kind of a state of limbo. But that whole episode really bothered me, the way it ended. It had to end, but it didn't have to end like that.
Well, thank you. First, I just want to underscore what you said about Cuba, which is we've had a policy of isolating Cuba, sanctions, and it's gone on for 70 years. The communist regime is still there. The countries where we didn't follow that route, including eventually Vietnam. I mean, there's China, communist China, Vietnam, of course, the countries of Eastern Europe. They're not communist at all. So we've really had a policy that has had the effect of maintaining the regime in Cuba. And to my mind, the first test of any foreign policy, national security question, is not whether it's right or wrong. It's whether it's going to work or not. And so it could be completely right, but if it doesn't work, it's not worth doing. And that certainly could be said about the Cuba policy. On Afghanistan, both Sarah, my wife, and I served in Afghanistan in 2009. And I think I'd just like to offer a slightly different view, actually a completely different view. If you look at the successive administration, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, I would put them in descending order of culpability for the disaster. The first and most responsible is the George W. Bush administration. They entered Afghanistan with a local partner, the Northern Alliance, with a handful of special forces and some B-52 bombing. The Northern Alliance won. And instead of turning it over to the Northern Alliance and saying, okay, now you solve the problem of Afghanistan, we're here to help you, but you want to deal with the Pashtuns, you figure it out in an Afghan way, we imposed our idea of a highly centralized state. Actually, Afghanistan always had a highly centralized constitution, but the Afghans never took that seriously. We put in a highly centralized constitution and took it seriously. So all power was concentrated in Kabul, in a country that is the most diverse ethnically and geographically, and within Kabul, concentrated in the president. I mean, if you'd had a parliamentary system, you would have had all the other ethnic groups, Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, Turkmen, would have been some process of negotiation. Actually, it works better in Iraq. So that was fault number one. Obama had a surge, and again, basically centralized things. Trump negotiated what was and Biden incidentally opposed the Obama policies as vice president. That's very clear. In Trump, he signed the surrender deal, basically, with the Taliban. And by the time Biden took office, there were 2,500 troops. So what do? And the deal was, while the U.S. was withdrawing, the Taliban would not attack. So if you break the deal and keep the troops there, the Taliban's going to attack, and you're going to have to re-escalate because 2,500 troops can't defend very much. So it was either go back in or finish the choice that Biden faced, or finish the pullout. Now, if you start to pull out all your friends, you are basically at that point saying the whole thing's going to collapse. You're going to cause the collapse. And it wasn't obvious. When you look back, of course, that may be what you should have done. But when you're looking forward, after all, you have an Afghan army that's 3 times the size of the Taliban. You have an Afghan army with state-of-the-art American equipment and Taliban with a bunch of guys on pickup trucks with machine guns. It's not unrealistic to think that they could have held out, although I don't know, Sarah and I didn't think they could. But still, it wasn't unrealistic. But if you start pulling everybody out, you're guaranteeing that result. To me, the core responsibility for the failure in Afghanistan rests with people that we don't like to criticize, namely the U.S. military, and particularly General Petraeus, who sold the idea that this was a counterinsurgency. And if you read Petraeus's doctrine, to have a successful counterinsurgency, you need to have a partner. And the partner, why? Because your forces can clear the insurgents. But then what do? You need a local partner who can provide, security, a good administration, and economic development. And if all that happens, then the least committed insurgents come to your side. The medium committed insurgents, lay low. And the extremists, well, everybody else is now happy. They rat them out, and the insurgency's over. That's the strategy. There was never a partner. Our partner in Afghanistan, which was our creation, not Northern Alliance, not the guys who won, our creation was corrupt, ineffective, and after repeated fraudulent elections, including the one that led to my recall, illegitimate. And so it wasn't surprising that a counterinsurgency strategy wouldn't work. And I have to tell you, a few days after the fall of Kabul, there was an event at the Atlantic Council, and I asked Petraeus about it. You know what he said? He said, I said, how could you have this strategy work if you don't have a partner? He said, well, you go to war with the partner you have. Well, I'm sorry. If your strategy depends on a magic wand and all you have is a stick, you don't keep saying it's a magic wand, you adopt a new strategy. Anyhow, that was my little dissent there, Tim.
No. Well, you asked me what I thought about the Biden administration, not about Obama and Trump and Bush. So I don't really disagree with much of anything
Okay,
that
well,
you said.
fair enough. We need to get to the elephant in the room.
We need to let these people ask some questions.
Give us I want to go just to one more question to you, because I know everybody wants to know about Gaza, and in particular about the application of the Leahy Amendment. Does the Leahy Amendment require the cutoff of U.S. military support to Israel?
Okay, so the Leahy Law, which was not known or named the Leahy Law when I drafted it, it just got named that over time, back in 1997, has been amended many times over the years, and it's really amazing to me that it has been institutionalized to the extent that it has. At the time it originated, I never thought that it would become a topic of such conversation as it has today. And if there's anything good that comes out of this catastrophe in Gaza, it's that people are asking about the Leahy Law. Because since the early 2000s, Senator Leahy sent letters to various secretaries of state and to the government of Israel about the failure to implement the Leahy Law with respect to the Israeli Defense Forces. The Leahy Law is quite simple. It applies equally, or at least it's drafted in a way that is to be applied equally to every recipient of U.S. military or other security assistance. It doesn't create one standard for certain countries and another standard for other countries. It does, however, empower the secretary with the decision to determine if there is credible information of a gross violation of human rights by not a foreign security force, but a unit of a foreign security force. And that was a really important distinction that we made when it was written, because there were already laws on the books which called for cutting off assistance to countries that violate human rights in a consistent pattern. And no administration, including Jimmy Carter, had ever actually applied that law. And so the reason that the Leahy Law was written was because I felt like we needed to come up with an approach that actually would work. And the best that we could think of was applying it in as narrow a way possible to those units of foreign security forces that were actually implicated in specific abuses. That is, not the entire armed forces of Israel or any other country, but those that had participated in a particular gross violation. And those are the worst crimes: murder, rape, torture, forced disappearance, things of that nature. And what it says is that if the secretary has credible information of such a crime having been occurred by a unit of a foreign security force, then that unit is no longer eligible for U.S. assistance. Or individual. It could be an individual, but a unit is the term that we used. And that law has been applied in many countries over the years to deny assistance to different units of foreign security forces that were implicated credibly in serious crimes, from Pakistan to Indonesia to Guatemala to Ethiopia. It's actually become, as I said, institutionalized. We provide every year $20 million to the Department of State to enforce the law. There are 15 staff people at the State Department whose job it is to essentially assess information and determine what is credible and what isn't. It has never been applied to the Israeli Defense Forces. And as I said, starting in about 2006, I have a file about an inch thick of correspondence with different administrations raising concerns about why it hasn't been applied, asking them about specific cases where we felt it should have been applied, and invariably the responses I got were not worth the paper they were printed on. In the case of the Biden administration, you know, what we've had is essentially an administration that has said that the law is being applied to Israel in the same way that it's being applied everywhere, which anyone who is in my job knows is not true. It has never been applied. Now, recently there were 4 cases where the Secretary did determine that certain units of the Israeli Defense Forces had committed gross violations. But in each case, he determined that adequate steps were being taken to, and the law requires, bring those individuals responsible to justice, which no objective person could say has happened. And so, you know, we have been very disappointed because we think that if the Leahy Law had been applied as was intended, as it was written, if it had been interpreted as any rational person would understand it to mean, it might have made a difference. It might have deterred some of the actions that have been taken by the Israeli Defense Forces against Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank. And, you know, if people know that there is some consequence or they're going to be accountable, you know, that deters people from acting in a way that could trigger a law like this. But since it never has been, you know, there hasn't really been any pattern of accountability on the part of the Israeli Defense Forces. It's, you know, there is a military justice system in Israel. Sometimes soldiers are disciplined. Occasionally they're imprisoned, but it's the rare exception. And so the answer is that this is an ongoing conversation we're having with the administration. We have very strong disagreements about this subject. We don't think that they've really been straight with us about the fact that it hasn't been applied. And I think that, again, you know, maybe the next administration will be different. We can only hope.
But isn't the problem not just individual units, but the policy of the approach of the State of Israel? Israel basically has the same technology that U.S. does. And I witnessed this firsthand in northeast Syria in the fight against the Islamic State, both seeing it and talking to ISIS women who survived. Basically what would happen, the U.S. could see a prized terrorist target in a car with his wife and children. They wouldn't blow the car up. They would wait until the car got someplace and the fighter or the terrorist leader was separate from the women and children, and then they'd take out the terrorist leader. And sometimes they wouldn't take out a really important target because of the collateral damage. And here, and even under international law, I mean, your response has to be proportional. So, of course there might be collateral damage, but you cannot lawfully blow up a hospital because there's a tunnel underneath it. So isn't it a much broader problem than just individual units?
No question about it.
Yeah.
But the Leahy Law is rather narrowly focused on individual cases involving specific units that are responsible. The policy itself, unquestionably, the strategy, you know, in our view, was flawed from the beginning, and you know, the costs have been horrific.
All right. Well, let me turn this over to you with your questions. We're running a little behind schedule, but we have a couple people who work for the Senate, and in my case, a former senator, albeit in Vermont, you get a certain amount of filibuster. Yeah, so, you there? Yeah. We'll get a microphone to you.
Hi. How about that? That's better. Hi. Tim, your boss was one of 4 senators last fall. Yeah, thank you. Last fall, your boss was one of 4 senators to lead a letter expressing concerns about the U.S.-Saudi deal, which would guarantee troops and nukes for the Saudis, and at the same time undermining Palestinian self-determination. So in the fall, will your boss lead the pushback on this bad deal when Congress comes back? This also plays into what you were saying about how these things are applied and what can be done about it, and what Senator Welch will do. Thank you.
Well, I think his views on this are, you know, a matter of record. I don't know exactly what he's going to do. It depends on, you know, what the decision is that we have to make exactly. I don't know if there's going to be a resolution of disapproval or what exactly is going to happen. But my assumption is that he will be consistent, as he has been in the past, on this question, and yet I'm always hesitant to, you know, make declarations about anything as far as what a senator is going to do, even one that I work for, without, you know, at least having the chance to talk with him and know all the, you know, the consequences or the implications. But, you know, he's been pretty clear where he stands on that, and I think he will continue to be.
Without getting into any of the specifics, I just have to comment. I actually worry much more about MBS having a nuclear weapon than I do about Iran.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. Thank you, Tim, for the work that you've done on the Leahy Law and the work that you're doing with Senator Welch. We appreciate his statements on Gaza. We would, today at noon, Senator Sanders actually committed to the Senior Center, several hundred people at the Senior Center, that he would sponsor a joint resolution of disapproval on the $20 billion in weapons sales that the Biden administration is now recommending. We're very pleased about that. He committed to be a leader on that. I guess my question to you is whether you will ask Senator Welch to co-sponsor that resolution. I understand there's 15 days to do that, so the time is very short.
Yeah, I know that this is already something that Senator Welch is focused on. I have no doubt that he will support Senator Sanders. The concern that Peter has, as he expressed to me, was how do we get more people, not just the usual suspects? You know, how do we get more than just a handful of people to support something so that the message that results is not that 95 members of the Senate oppose us? So, you know, I don't think the issue here is going to be whether he's going to support Bernie Sanders. That's, I think, a given. The question, though, is, you know, is it just going to be another vote like we had last time with a handful of people? We all know who they are, overwhelmingly defeated. And I think if we can convince others beyond Sanders and Welch and a few others to support a resolution like that, that would make a big difference. Yeah. No, I'm not debating whether or not the resolution is important to do, and you know that Senator Welch and some others will support it. I'm just saying that, you know, and I could talk for a long time about this. That is, you know, how you make a difference in the United States Senate, and you always have to think about, you know, how what you do is going to be interpreted if you're going to lose badly. Because a lot of people would interpret that as simply a reaffirmation of the position that we're against. That doesn't mean that we're not going to oppose it. It's rather that, you know, the more that we can do to convince others to join us, the more impact it will have. And sometimes that is a function of the text of the resolution, how it's worded. And I haven't seen what Bernie Sanders has in mind, but I can tell you that the last time he introduced a resolution to invoke Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, which is one of the provisions I was alluding to previously, which cuts off aid to countries that engage in a pattern of consistent violations of human rights. And, you know, it just wasn't drafted well. And if he had just talked to us ahead of time, because it's a subject that some of us know quite a bit more about than his staff, I think we could have gotten a significant number of additional senators to join, and it would have had more impact. And so, you know, it's not a question of whether it's the right thing to do, it's a question of how to go about it in the most effective way.
Thank you for this conversation. In this very room a couple of years ago, I met a lovely couple who came here from Afghanistan after the fall of Kabul. And they left behind 10 children. And we have spent, there are several people on this committee that sponsored this lovely couple who have tried every which way to get these children here and have been told that there's absolutely no way to get them here. We've written letters to the White House, to the State Department. We have called our senators. We have gotten nowhere. And we have been told by lawyers that at best it'll be 7 or 8 years before these children can come here. The youngest of these children are 4-year-old twins. I'm asking you, your first story, Mr. Galbraith, was about reuniting mothers and their children, the victim of rapes. Mr. Reiser, you talked about the fall of Kabul, what a disaster that was. I'm asking you both for guidance how we can reunite these families who have been so rendered hopeless in the face of this disaster.
Peter's going to take care of that family. No, as I said, I spent an hour and a half on the phone this morning with Molly Gray about exactly this issue. There's this family, but there's many other families with spouses and children stranded in Afghanistan. And these, the men who, you know, worked as translators or others involved in the war there are here in Vermont. They have no idea if they're going to see their families again. Some of them are talking about going back to Afghanistan because obviously they're at a point where they've close to given up. So this is an issue that we are very conscious of. It is a nightmare for these families. There aren't easy solutions, but the answer should not be no, you know, we can't do this.
Well, I'll say two things. First, what went on in Syria and Iraq had nothing to do with U.S. immigration laws, getting the children for the mothers, and frankly, it had to do with the connections that I've had with the Kurds over 40 years. So it was really a kind of personal thing. Dealing with U.S. immigration laws is, you know, I mean, it's very hard for a private citizen, which is what I am. And I will tell you, Sarah, who also is my wife, who served in Afghanistan, and I, after Kabul fell, we spent weeks, and incidentally, my nephew was the head of the State Department task force dealing with this. He's a Foreign Service officer with individual cases. I had all the UN employees because I was the Assistant Secretary General in the UN in Afghanistan. I had all the people who worked for me. And we spent weeks. And do you know how many successes we had? The answer is 0. So I mean, it's very, very sad and very frustrating. Well, I wouldn't say that our experience is going to be a good recommendation. So, I mean,
Yeah,
Tim is going to have.
I don't think it's, well, it's really the job of the government to help these families, it seems to me. I mean, there are people like you and Molly and others who are working at the local level and trying to provide services and take care of them as best as you can. But really, it's the responsibility of the government to solve problems like this. And so, one of the issues is that we're dealing with the intelligence agencies. We're dealing with the U.S. Border Patrol people, which is a nightmare, I have to tell you. So we're as, frustrated in many ways as I'm sure that you are, but that does not mean that we are just going to walk away from these people.
On this side of the room.
I'm Bruce Frauman. He's told to introduce myself from South Londonderry. Came here specifically for this, so thank you. My question is, the only thing that Mr. Trump said that ever made any sense to me, and I'd like your opinion, is that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which you've talked about, influenced Putin to invade Russia. Ukraine, I'm sorry.
My view, utter nonsense. First, the responsibility for the fiasco in Afghanistan rests with Donald Trump. He was the guy who negotiated what effectively was a surrender deal.
Exactly.
And Joe Biden had 2,500 troops. So his choice was put in another 50,000 or carry out the Trump surrender deal. And the way in which this guy slimily tries to get around his own responsibility is appalling. And I'm not sure this is meant to be a partisan occasion, but let's sure as hell hope that the rest of the American people are as intelligent as those of us here in Vermont. I'm afraid I'm not entirely optimistic about that. Putin. Of course, can't get into Putin's mind except I've seen this film before. What is it? What is it that happened? The first, and leaders do this all the time, they believe their own propaganda. So he persuaded himself that Ukrainians are really just Russians. It's a different dialect. And having persuaded himself of that, he persuaded himself that it was going to be easy. A military force is most powerful the day before you actually use it. And this was Putin's problem. I would urge you to, and I showed this video, I think, when I did the lecture on Ukraine a couple of years ago. The meeting where of his National Security Council, everybody's 20 feet apart from each other because it's he's paranoid about COVID, in which he asks the head of the SVR, of the Foreign Intelligence Service, their equivalent of the CIA, whether he supports recognizing the breakaway regions of Donbass and Luhansk. And he humiliates the guy, because he's so convinced of the rightness of what he's doing, and it's so clear that this key person in his administration thought it was nuts. And you have to, you have to think there are a lot of people like that. You just look at the body language when the head of the Soviet military, I think it was the general staff, is told to prepare for a nuclear, possible nuclear war. And he's like, yes, Mr. President. I mean, it was like, or even Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group. This was not something that was influenced by Afghanistan. It's something, a brain worm in Putin's head.
Before we take this question here, though, because we didn't get to some of the topics that we were supposed to during your comments, could you just comment on China? Is China as much of a threat to the United States as it seems to be when you look at the Biden administration's words? Who wants to take that?
I'll take a shot at that, and I will say no. This is an exercise of strategists looking for an enemy. Where is the United States and China going to fight? Do we really care about a bunch of reefs in the South China Sea? And actually, to the extent that China's not going to put a chain across it. There's no freedom of navigation issue. If they did, you can sail around it. The entire world's commerce does not depend on what happens in the South China Sea. And I've actually sort of dealt with this issue with the Philippines. And it's much more likely to be resolved if we're not involved in it. I mean, do you think there would be a Panama Canal Treaty if the Soviet Union had been backing Panama? No. So to the extent we get involved, I mean, we take away the incentive for China to deal with its own neighbors. So that's just one issue. People say, oh, what about the Chinese footprint around the world? All the money they're spending in Africa. Well, what are they going to do with it? Are they going to make the African countries communist? Because China's not communist. Are they going to settle Chinese there? Well, no. And anyhow, China has a big demographic problem. Its population is declining rapidly. The one issue is Taiwan, which is entirely different legally from Ukraine. And let's be blunt about it. We recognize, and the entire world recognizes that China and Taiwan are one country. There are a handful of countries that recognize that Taiwan is the Republic of China, but almost everybody else recognizes that the People's Republic of China includes Taiwan. That's not to say that there should be a green light to some kind of invasion, which would not be easy for the Chinese. But it's something to be managed to avoid a provocation. And otherwise, what is there for the U.S. and China to fight about except for strategists, and this is my view, who want to justify their existence by thinking in these terms, including those who say, China is a rising power, the U.S. is a declining one, the Thucydides trap, that always means war. Over what?
I don't have much to add. I've always argued that, our policy ought to be looking for ways to cooperate with China. Obviously, we have big differences. We compete in many ways, but we also have many areas where we could be working more cooperatively with the Chinese. We can't fight a war with China. It would be a disaster, and why would we? But we certainly ought to be talking differently, because there seem to be members of Congress who would like us to fight a war with China over Taiwan, which would be lunacy. So my view is, let's talk to the Chinese differently about ways that we can work together on issues that we both care about.
And incidentally, if they got their way, you know what they could forget about? All their cell phones.
Tim, thanks so much for all your comments and your advocacy for human rights. In light of what the ICC has said, what the ICJ has said, what can you enlighten us as to why, I'm particularly heartbroken that Democratic colleagues of Senator Sanders and Senator Welch, Representative Balint, don't seem to have the spine to oppose clear a clear genocide that's going on in Israel. And I say this as a Jewish person. Heartbreaking to see 5,000 children, 40 killed, 40,000 civilians, 80,000 wounded, all the schools, all the hospitals, 2/3 of the housing stock demolished, and only Welch and Sanders and Beckett, to an extent, have, talked about an arms embargo. What is it? Is it AIPAC that they're worried about? Is it the Christian Zionists that they're worried about? I'm curious if you could, let us know why Democrats, I understand about Republicans, why Democrats are not standing up in the same way that your boss is.
Thank you.
Well, those other Democrats weren't elected by Vermonters. That makes a difference. It's I think pretty apparent the influence that the American Jewish community has with members of Congress. Certainly, AIPAC's influence goes back a long time and is a factor for sure in, so I can't speak for other members, but I know that having worked there for many, many years, any criticism of Israel is often to invite kind of a backlash which no member of Congress wants to have to answer to, and so it's easier just to go along, and that has been the tradition. And I don't think it's actually served the United States. I don't think it's served Israel, and I think the situation today kind of bears that out, and that we obviously have an interest in defending Israel. They're surrounded by enemies, and there's a long history there, but that doesn't mean that we should do so unconditionally, and particularly when the current government of Israel opposes every policy that has been long-standing with respect to how to resolve the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Why would we support a government that undercuts our own policies every day? It makes no sense to us. And so, those members will have to speak for themselves, but to us, you can support Israel, but you can do so in a way which also is consistent with our values, our principles, human rights, everything that we stand for in terms of how this conflict needs to be resolved, and particularly when we see the changes that have occurred in Israel. It's not the same country that it was when I started working in the Senate in many ways, and yet our policy has not accounted for that. I think it's admirable that at least our representatives, are willing to stand up and challenge that, but they are in the distinct minority. Peter, I'm sure, can say something about that.
I have the advantage of not seeking elective office anymore, and not holding any public office, and not likely to again. So, but I was at the Democratic convention, and I think it's important to understand that the politics of this issue is shifting. People actually, Democratic strategists, are much more concerned about Muslim voters in Michigan than they are about Jewish voters in New York or Florida, because those states don't matter. I mean, if Harris carries Florida, she's going to win, and there's no chance that Trump is going to carry New York. Pennsylvania, the Jewish vote there is significant, but the other side of that is that Jewish voters have pretty much made up their mind one way or the other, and if they like Netanyahu, they're not going to vote for Harris. So that brings me to the second point. If you look at the what are the strategic objectives that Hamas has had and that Netanyahu's had? Guess who wins? Hamas. What did, when on October 6th, the Palestinian issue was a fourth-tier issue in the world, way behind Ukraine, climate change, Taiwan, and some other things I can't even think of. They made it a top-tier issue in a very brutal and cruel way, gunning down kids at a music festival. Yeah, but they did. And they knew that, and they knew exactly how Israel would respond. They knew what Netanyahu would do. They entirely expected what had happened. What did they think would be the result? Inflame Arab opinion, inflame Muslim opinion. I'm not sure they realized just how much they flamed American opinion. That's a big plus for them. And who's played into their hands? Who's been their ally? Bibi Netanyahu and the extremists. The extent to which Israel, which when I started working, even 6 years before Tim, any criticism of Israel was off the table. I handled the Near East and South Asia, but not Israel and the Palestinians, because I wasn't thought of as entirely reliable enough. The guy who did, all he ever did was one thing. He wrote speeches about Odrami. Oh, you don't know what Odrami is? Our only democratic, reliable ally in the Middle East. Odrami. That's what we used to call it as code. So that's all changed. And that's going to have long-term consequences. And then what Tim has to say about the changing nature of Israel too. Now, if you want to discuss, and I just sent your boss a little note about this because he asked, how do you think it might change? Well, there are two things that have to happen before anything is going to change. You have to get rid of Netanyahu and his government, and you have to get rid of Hamas. The opposition to Israel in the United States, and frankly, cutting off weapons to Israel, is something that will undermine Netanyahu, and therefore get to the objective of three objectives. First, a use of military force consistent with international law, meaning you minimize civilian casualties. Second, a ceasefire. And third, to try to get back to the two-state solution, which is the only feasible solution. Oh, except, really? You think the Israelis want a one-state solution? Because what does that actually mean? You know, the Likud slogan was also the river to the sea. And if you go to a one-state solution, well, Israel ends up annexing the West Bank, maybe Gaza. It's not going to let the Palestinians vote, not this government. But sooner or later, there's going to be an election in Israel. The left will win because no party remains in power forever. And they will win with Arab votes. There'll be Arab members of the Knesset. What's the first thing they're going to do? Extend the franchise. Because why wouldn't you? That's what you do when you're in power. And the end result could well be not a Palestinian state, but in Israel that is exactly what the PLO charter said it should be, which is a secular democratic state, but not at all a Jewish state. In my first visit to Israel, I had lunch with Abba Eban, the longtime foreign minister, and he said, Israel can be two of the following three things. It can be a democracy, it can be a Jewish state, and it can have the West Bank and Gaza, West Bank. But it can't be all three. That was 40 years ago. That's absolutely true today. It cannot have all three.
I think we have time for one more question. So I guess it's hard. I know what you're going to, okay, give it to Isaac. Go ahead.
Sure, my name is Evans France. I'm the director of Action Corps. Thanks so much for coming back to Windham County. A lot of foreign policy staff really don't have much connection to the states they're from, and we're so grateful for the time that you, all of us Vermonters. Okay. What you were talking about in terms of the joint resolution of disapproval and the concerns about wanting to get enough senators on here to really have a strong showing of support. Was defeated in January. That any senator had invoked Section 502B of Foreign Assistance Act of U.S. law in regards to Israel. So it was an important marker, and the fact that we got a dozen senators supporting was significant. It was double digits, and it showed substantial concern. And thank you very much. Having 15 senators on a joint resolution of disapproval would be an increase and would show the Harris campaign, it would show President Biden too, that there's serious section of the Democratic Party in the Senate that is taking this seriously. So I'm really glad to hear that you're going to continue talking about this with your colleagues, and I think that Bernie's staff could certainly use some guidance and support in building more support for this, so especially from somebody who's been in for the Senate for decades. The area where I have questions is where we're dealing with, and it's just going.
Here, I think we've got it, and the questions about the War Powers Act. We want to get one last question here, and we'll take them both together. Is that okay? Well, if you literally make it a question.
The question is, what can be done to use congressional war powers right now in regards to the U.S. dropping bombs on Yemen directly and without congressional authorization, and in regards to military intelligence sharing with the Israeli Defense Forces, which constitutes participation in hostilities according to the 1973 War Powers Resolution, Section 8C. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, and we'll just have a question, if we may.
A question. Okay,
Yes.
I'll try to figure out how to put it into a question. Now, you're familiar with NAPCA, right? And that happened in 1948 when Israelis invaded Palestine. Oh, can people hear me? Okay, in 1948, I have to give it context, okay?
Well, I think we, Tim and I will probably understand and can explain the context if you go directly to the question.
The struggle has been ongoing, and to make a long story short, Western coverage tends to be biased, and I think it's imperative for people to understand that Hamas did not even exist till the 70s, and this has been going on since 1948. And I want to know what you think about it. What do you think about it?
Okay, Tim. Well, War Powers Act, and I think you've expressed, I think both of us have expressed our views about the situation. So if you have something to add, that would be great.
Yeah.
Otherwise, go to War Powers.
The War Powers Act, applies when U.S. forces are deployed in hostilities. And, I think one can argue that by supplying weapons to the Saudis that have been used in Yemen and our own forces' actions there, as well as our support for Israel and Gaza, one could argue that these are circumstances which should trigger the War Powers Act. I can assure you there are differences of opinion about that in the Congress. Whether or not there is enough interest in taking on this issue in that manner, because there are different ways that we could try to make the point that continued U.S. weapons and munitions for Israel to be used in Gaza should end. Whether this would be the best strategy or not, I think would be something that we would need to discuss. Again, I always come back to, it's great to get 12 votes, but it would be a lot better to get 22 votes on something, particularly if it's the first time that you're invoking a critical piece of legislation like 502B. You want to come out strong the first time to show that, you know, there's really a critical mass of support for your position, for something which has never been done before. Whether the War Powers Act is the right approach here, I honestly don't know. It's something well worth discussing, but I think we can also anticipate what the vote would be. And so we have to think about, you know, ultimately what message we're trying to send.
So I started working for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which had jurisdiction over the War Powers Act in 1979. So just 6 years after the act was enacted. It's actually only been invoked once, and that was at the time of the Mayaguez, an American ship that was seized by the Khmer Rouge in 1975. Successive administrations have ignored it. They haven't always ignored the spirit in the sense that Bush Sr. got authorization for the first Gulf War, and Bush Jr. got authorization for the second Gulf War. And he got authorization for basically Afghanistan, and actually more broadly, the war on terror. There's a second issue about war powers. Do you imagine for 1 nanosecond that a so-called Supreme Court, because it's not really a court, I'm sorry to say, would uphold the War Powers Act when it determines that a president is actually immune from any criminal liability for any act he commits that has some colorable official status? No, I really don't think so. So I think that the better way to approach this is not by a law, which was a great law, but is honestly a dead letter, but rather through the appropriations process, where, I know a guy who knows something about that, where actually it kind of requires like 51 votes, and it's pretty unambiguous. There are nuances that he knows and I've forgotten in all of this, but you know, the likelihood, whatever you may think of the morality of it, the likelihood of success is very slim at this point in time.
Yeah, and that's kind of my point. You know, it's one thing to believe that it should apply, and on the merits, it's the right thing to do. It's another thing, you know, to think about what are you actually trying to achieve. If the goal here is to end U.S. support for weapons and munitions for the Israelis to be used in Gaza, well, that's a function of whether we stop paying for it. We don't have the votes to do that, but we might have the votes to at least put some conditions on the way U.S. equipment is used. We tried that in an informal way a few months ago. The administration basically ignored it. And you know, I think that's something that we absolutely need to revisit, because we negotiated an outcome with the administration that required them to report and find certain, make certain determinations. What they did was not borne out by the facts, in our opinion. And so, you know, I think it's incumbent on us now to respond to that. But I also think that Peter's right about the War Powers Act as much as I wish he wasn't.
Right. Let me just add one thing here, which I think is quite important. I'm sure you've noticed how dysfunctional the Congress has been for a very long time, 30 years now.
The entire time I've been there.
Yeah. No cause and effect. And one consequence of that dysfunction is to transfer power from the Congress to the executive, and probably across the board, but nowhere more than in foreign affairs, where the executive already has considerable latitude. You know, when I started, we could say with a straight face that we're a co-equal branch of government, and including in foreign affairs. I mean, that's a laughable proposition. Where does this lead us? If you're looking for change, it's going to be in the president. And whatever you may feel about the Biden administration and the vice president who's part of it, You have to look at what the alternative. What has Donald Trump said? He said, finish the job, Netanyahu. What has J.D. Vance said about Ukraine? I couldn't care less about Ukraine. What has Trump said? Basically, they opposed even aid to Ukraine. So, you have to decide where you want. That's where it matters. Now, I just want to say a word about the Vice President's acceptance speech, which included a couple of sentences about Gaza. And some people were disappointed she didn't say more. If she had said more, the entire story of that acceptance speech would be about Gaza. That would have been an unacceptable and politically suicidal thing to do, and it would have been unacceptable because she's running for president with a whole range of issues. And if she had said nothing, that probably would have been the big story too. But what did she say? She said something that, in my view, had a significant change in tone. And so I would look forward to some changes. And if any of you have relatives in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and God knows why Nevada, but apparently that seems to be important too, you might have a conversation with them.
Well, thank you, Peter Galbraith. Thank you, Tim Reiser. We didn't get to a lot of things that we wanted to tonight, but of course we don't have unlimited time, but you will be joining us to have a few, maybe a couple of cocktails and a little
another
food.
3 or 4 hours.
And maybe then we could talk about the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the role of the United Nations, and multiple other things, that climate change, the big elephant in the room and the world. So thank you so much. And join us then for the reception and more conversation. Thank you, everyone.